Hey, welcome. Tonight we're going to continue our critical thinking basics course or set of videos. And today we're going to kind of switch gears from talking about strict theories of argumentation and logic, and we're going to start to talk about basically individual biases. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some things that are really popular in psychology and to a certain extent self-help, that kind of stuff. I'll make some caveats, but what we're going to focus on is basically ways that individuals make decisions and ways that those can go basically wrong. Now, a lot of times, there's something we can do with logical stuff, but to a certain extent some of this stuff is just kind of like hardwired into the neurobiology of humanity, and I'll kind of talk about how to lessen some of the errors, but that's what we're going to get at now. To get started, one of the things that I just want to impress is how interesting your brain is. So for example, if you take both fists and you ball them up and you put them together, that is roughly the size of your brain. The brain is not that big of an organ. Generally speaking, it's probably around 3 pounds. And that organ, being 3 pounds or so, a little over a kilogram, consumes about 20% of the energy and oxygen that your body uses on a daily basis. That's pretty wild. The figure that you very often hear is that your brain is 2% of your bodily mass, but it consumes 20% of the energy in your body. So the brain is just this fascinating organ. And if you've ever in like a neurobiology lab or something like that ever been able to see it, it's kind of it's a very strange feeling seeing a brain, and it's this neurochemical electrical kind of soupy thing that is basically the consistency of jello. It's so delicate that you have to use chemicals to make it a little harder so that you can handle it in labs and stuff like that. And yet that is the source of pretty much everything in our lives: our consciousness, our subjective experiences, our abilities to think through things. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the brain and some of its tendencies. Now, generally speaking, your brain is just this amazing thing that's evolved over millions of years. And the reason why I say that is a lot of animals have brains and central nervous systems. Ours just tends to be a little bit more complicated, especially with all of the wrinkly bits on the outside, the neocortex especially. The upside is that over those many years, millennia, eons, the brain has learned how to be incredibly adaptive, and it's learned how to do the things that we very often have to do very quickly, very efficiently. Our brain is adaptive, and it's really good at making patterns, making up stories. And so, for example, there's a scholar by the name of Jonathan Gottschall, and he wrote this book called The Storytelling Animal, where one of his central ideas is that part of what makes humans humans is our ability to tell stories. Now he is in a related discipline, so that is especially useful to his research. But it also seems kind of right. One of the things that we see in very early evidence of like people who lived in caves is cave paintings. We see ceremonial hearths where people would sit around a fire and presumably exchange stories. Language is incredible. Pretty much every single culture around the world has mythology or has religion or has something where we're telling stories. It's an incredibly important part of us as individuals trying to make sense of our own lives, and of us as communities trying to come together and figure out what beliefs we stand for and how we're going to organize our lives with one another. But the downside is our brain is really good at making up stories. And here I'm using this term ambiguously, but the idea is, stories can add a lot of meaning to our lives, but there are times, scientific discourse, maybe political discourse, whenever we're trying to be unbiased, we're trying to get at the phenomena that we're describing, that making up stories is not what we want to do. And so another scholar and in philosophy, he's very popular. Kasim Kassam wrote a very famous book on conspiracy theories. He's written a lot of books on extremism, and he kind of talks about this psychological tendency of humans to connect dots with things, and that's basically what we're going to talk about. So your brain is this amazing organ that can help to make sense of so many things. Just think of what human life has gone like, or how much it's changed in the past maybe 100 years. In the early 1900s, you might not have had electricity or running water or anything like that. Now, not only do we have that as pretty much standard in most of the United States, we have mini computers that we have constant access to in smartphones. We have technology that routinely changes. And the fact that we as animals are able to adapt to all of that says a lot about our brain and how we're able to get through stuff. And so the upside is, it's really good that we're able to adapt. The downside is a lot of that history of evolution that has taught us how to deal with things sometimes makes it a little bit more complicated whenever we come to something like logic, where we're trying to get at the truth of the matter, or try to be impartial, try to be unbiased, and trying to slow down and be more intentional. Now, one of the things that's really important for this kind of work is the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and they won so many awards. But this book right here is, and I'm sorry that it's washed out by my light a little bit, but Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's a little bit of a tome, but it's written very accessibly, and if you want to get in to some pop cognitive psychology, I think it's a really great book. But Kahneman really popularized this notion of what's sometimes called a two-system model of psychology, or of cognition, the way that the brain thinks through things. And it would be cool if there were better names than this instead of just System 1 and System 2. Nonetheless, I mean, I think System 1 and System 2 do make a little bit of sense. So I'm just quoting Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow here. He says, System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. In other words, it's basically a system in our brain, if we want to think about thinking falling into two categories. It's the system that's really fast. It's unconscious. There's a lot of stuff that we can do. We can recognize people's facial expressions, usually very quickly. If we hear a noise and we need to get away from it, we'll flinch or we'll move in another direction. That sort of fast stuff is what really helps us to do stuff. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, whenever something becomes routine, that's System 1 operating. There is so much in the world that we don't have to think about, but is really, really complex, that System 1 is working on. And I think that really major injuries or going under anesthesia or something like that can kind of bring that to the fore. There's just so much that we don't realize that we're using, where if we, for example, hurt our ankle, or if we have to be on really strong medicines that make us groggy or something like that. Now something like walking or listening to someone or figuring out where we're going to go or remembering certain things is a lot harder. That's kind of System 1 working. It's fast, it's unconscious, it does stuff automatically, quickly. System 2, he defines as this. System 2 allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including computations. The operations of System 2 are often associated with subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. In other words, it's slow, it's conscious. Whenever you are aware of slowing down, appreciating things, whenever you face something difficult in life and you're thinking through all of the options, whenever you're in a class and you're learning a new discipline of inquiry, that is System 2. That's what's going on with System 2. And very often, I think, especially in a class like critical thinking, there's a way in which a lot of what we're doing is we're acknowledging how system one basically colors the lenses through which we see the world. And generally speaking, that can get us pretty far. But whenever we are doing complicated things, such as figuring out who we are, figuring out how we want to relate to other people, how we want to organize our societies, that probably is something worth slowing down, slowing down and using that system two process. Now, as I said in the previous slide, the brain uses a ton of energy. It takes a ton of effort to do that. It makes sense evolutionarily why we would want a really big system one, because we wouldn't necessarily want to have to think through every single thing that we see. Imagine the massive amount of energy and how slow it would be if you had to think about every little thing you had to do, putting one foot in the other whenever you're walking, making sure that your right arm moves forward whenever your left leg moves forward, right? Just coordinating something like that. Thinking about looking at someone and like having to spend 5-10 seconds to figure out what their facial expression is kind of telling you. System one is crucially important. System two is also important, but it takes a ton of energy and attention. So that's the contrast that we're going to get at, and we're going to kind of start to break this down. And the next lecture is going to talk about more of these biases. One of the things that's really important to set out, though, is basically biases and heuristics. Now, a bias is unfortunately a very difficult word to define. In fact, I looked up in a lot of scientific papers to see if I could find a good definition, and I couldn't find one. Very often I found that people were defining biased in relation to being unbiased. Unbiased is kind of the way that we want to think. Very often it's thought of in terms of data, but you can just think of bias as being some sort of tendency in thinking. There is a pattern. Usually that pattern is a deviation from the norm, so it's doing something different, but you can think of a bias as just kind of like a general tendency to do something or think in a certain way. Heuristic is used a lot more in these types of literature that I'm talking about. Now I'm talking about cognitive psychology. I'm talking about maybe pop psychology in certain ways. And again, Daniel Kahneman defines it as a simple procedure that helps find adequate, though often imperfect, answers to difficult questions. In other words, and if you just want a two-word definition of what a heuristic is, it's a mental shortcut. Now think about the term shortcut. A shortcut means that basically you're finding a very, very quick way to do something. It might not be the most efficient, to be perfectly honest. It might be way easier, way more illuminating to take a different route, but the shortcut will get you there fast. Similarly, heuristics will get you to a conclusion, but they're probably going to involve ignoring a ton of other information. So again, that type 1 thing, that pressure to process information quickly, to come to certain conclusions, that can get us there. And very often those heuristics will do so in an efficient manner. And what we mean by efficient here isn't true. That's not necessarily what a heuristic is doing. It's sort of good enough without spending all of the energy that it takes to slow down and attentively go through every piece of information that you're trying to process. That's all we mean by efficiency here. Okay. Now, the hard thing is trying to figure out what the valence, as far as like, is this a good thing or a bad thing whenever we're talking about heuristics and biases? And the answer is it's complicated. I know that's a very philosopher answer, a very lawyer answer, but I'm going to tell you it's complicated because it very often depends on whether the heuristic or the bias is having good effects or how pervasive it is in the way that you think or the way that you conduct your life. So heuristics, taking mental shortcuts, biases, finding these connections between things and creating tendencies, that can be really great in terms of having ways to save time or having something like a hunch. Maybe when you've been doing a job for a very long time and you just have a gut feeling of how something is going to turn out. Okay. I think that's an instance where these automatic processes are probably doing good stuff. But in a clinical sense, schizophrenia is also very much related to a set of mental disorders where your brain is finding connections between things that don't actually have connections. And so those phenomena can very often look similar, but the effects they have on your life are very, very different. And that's kind of what we have to be careful about here. Sometimes biases and heuristics can be okay, but again, in critical thinking and thinking through ethics and politics and all that sort of stuff, we probably want to slow down and question things. And that's what we're going to kind of get at tonight. Now, I do want to give a few cautions with respect to what I'm going to say, because there's a lot of bad stuff out there. If you've spent any time on Instagram or TikTok or anything like that, and you've seen reels of people sitting around with a fancy podcast setup and talking about this kind of stuff, or if you've gone through a self-help area or a business section in a bookstore, you will see a lot of these same phrases recycled. And I just have to say, psychology and social interactions are really complicated. I would highly recommend that you take a class like Intro to Psychology, Intro to Social Psychology, something like that, because you can get some really, really cool stuff out of a class like that. Pop psychology very often oversimplifies. Now, sometimes you just have to simplify because you have to know your audience. You aren't going to talk to a sixth grader in the same way that you're going to talk to a professor specializing in that particular thing. You teach a sixth grader to play the recorder. You do not have to talk about playing the recorder to an experienced jazz musician. You set things on different levels, right? But you have to be really careful not to take these pop psychology findings too seriously, because the science is always changing, especially with respect to psychology and neuroscience. So I just want to put that out there. Similarly, psychology and the behavioral sciences, so economics, sociology, any political science, any of these disciplines where they're doing empirical studies on people, one of the hallmarks of good empirical studies is that you should be able to find an effect, and then ideally other people would be able to replicate that same effect if they followed your same experimental procedure. If you took a class on the scientific method or lab sciences, you probably learned this pretty much day one, week one. That's how you do it. That's how you set up good experiments. But one of the things that has been happening past decade, maybe 2 decades, is a lot of people have been trying to replicate experimental designs and see if these effects hold up, and they don't always. And there are basically many popular instances of some professors fabricating data. Now, again, journals, for the most part, are doing things to make sure that scientists don't do this. So now they're not just publishing articles, but they're publishing data repositories. They're putting things under more scrutiny. Science is always evolving because it's trying to take this into account. Nonetheless, all of those qualifications aside, and I give you those qualifications because this is a university sort of level lecture, even though it's Introduction to Critical Thinking. I want to say at the level at which we're engaging the material today and the next couple of lectures, we'll be okay because we're just talking about the general lessons. But if you were to press on any of these issues or to research them, you inevitably would find many, many more complications. Now, I want to say something that I'm going to repeat at the end. And it's a very famous Latin phrase. You hear it in rhetoric, you hear it in law, and it's the Latin phrase cui bono, which basically just means who benefits. Who benefits? And so, especially when we're delving into something like thinking fast and thinking slow, or pop psychology, or blogs, or podcasts, one of the things that we should always ask is who's benefiting from this? And anytime someone is trying to get you onto a self-help, life hack, biohack, productivity hack, maybe even something quasi-religiously affiliated, you need to be really careful and try to assess what they're trying to get you to do. Because if it's a jacked up athletic dude who's trying to get you to think about the world and buy these philosophies and stuff like that, and male supplements, and it's convenient that they sell all of that on your web shop, maybe they're trying to benefit in a certain way. Or if it's your corporation putting you through company trainings to help you to become a more effective worker, guess who's benefiting from that, right? So be very careful with respect to some of this stuff, because as a part of how you think through things, very good thing, right? It's kind of like, I think it was a lecture or two ago, I said, whenever you learn to karate chop or to throw a jab, suddenly you want to do that all the time. Uh, Fine. You can do that. You can do that a little bit, but don't let this turn into your only major personality trait or your only way of seeing through things. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say here. So I've made the qualifications. Let's get into the content. And I think the first bit of content is this. Your brain. It's a pattern machine. And so what we have here is a GIF taken off of Wikipedia. This is an example of the clustering illusion, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But basically, the clustering illusion is the ability of your brain to find patterns in things despite the fact that they're really random. So if you've been watching this GIF while I've been talking, what's been happening is that each frame that the GIF moves forward, there are more data that are added to this plot. The data have been randomized, but what you're probably noticing is there are sections in this image where it looks like the data is clustering. That is pure illusion. Every single data point is randomly generated. You might start to see patterns as far as like maybe currents or something like that. That's not there. The data is random. But one of the reasons that you're seeing clusters, that you're seeing maybe ridges, kind of like a mountain, you're seeing trends in the data, is because your brain is so good at recognizing patterns. That can be really useful, but it can also be very detrimental. And that's what the clustering illusion is all about. It's the ability of your brain to see patterns. And this is what's happening in this particular GIF. Now there's a lot of ways of thinking through this. Maybe a funnier example is something like pareidolia, which is the ability of humans to be able to see faces in things that don't have faces. So this is a funny example from 2004, so a vintage example from 20 years ago, of someone who basically tried to sell, I can't remember whether they were successful, this particular grilled cheese sandwich for $28,000. In fact, I think it was successful. And it's because the grilled cheese sandwich looked like it has the face of the Virgin Mary on it. Again, just your brain is able to see stuff. That's pretty interesting. But see stuff to the tune of $28,000 for the Virgin Mary appearing on a grilled cheese sandwich, I don't know. There's a very, very famous spot on Mars that has it's called the Face on Mars. It's a particular region, and it very often looks like this. This freaked some people out whenever we got these images. A lot of conspiracy theorists wondered whether that meant that there was some really old, maybe abandoned civilization on Mars that had created a sculpture like this. But again, it's because our brain is really good at finding patterns, and pareidolia basically specifies not just any pattern, although sometimes we can do that, but patterns especially of faces. Now think about evolutionarily why that would make sense that we could see faces. Faces indicate a lot of important things for humans. You can generally, first of all, figure out whether it's someone that you grew up around. That's pretty important, especially if you used to live in areas where there might be warring tribes or families or something like that. Moreover, the ability to see faces, to understand emotions, might also indicate whether you want to approach that person or not. If that person looks like they're in a good mood, probably someone you want to approach and spend time with. If that person looks like they're angry, probably someone you want to give a little bit of distance to. It's really helpful to the survival of our species that we're able to see faces very quickly and that we're able to determine what that can help us to figure out about whether they're willing to cooperate with us or whether they wish us harm. Okay, so these things have a lot of really good uses that helped us for a very long time. Now, as a side effect, we can see faces in grilled cheeses. So there's these there's these artifacts, right? There's these strange things that those same capacities that really help us can sometimes produce these weird effects, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Of course, this is maybe infamously, although this is kind of old and outdated, the Rorschach tests, which are ink blot tests. And so this is a web comic by Lunar Baboon, and here you have a 4-panel comic. The first panel is an ink blot. The second panel is an older man saying, "I see a lifetime of anxiety, depression, and regrets. I also see death." And then the third panel is their kid saying "dad," just making sure that they're okay. And the fourth panel reveals that this ink blot that was in the first panel is actually just a spot on a cow, and the kid says it's a cow, right? Meaning it's not a lifetime of anxiety, depression, regrets, and a looming death. And then the dad says, "I don't see it." Right. I think this is something that's used in a lot of comics. I think I remember maybe a stand-up comedian or someone saying like, I went to the therapist the other day and they showed me these like ink blobs on paper, but the weirdest thing was that they were all pictures of my parents fighting. That kind of stuff. Again, patterns might indicate certain things. Patterns are interesting, but sometimes an ink blot is just an ink blot. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of terms that might help us with respect to some of this stuff. The first one is apophenia. Apophenia. And it's just generally the idea that we can connect with our brains unrelated things with meaning. So this is not necessarily a good thing because these are unrelated things. It's like with the clustering illusion, where it was random data, but we saw clusters. Apophenia is the same sort of thing, but it could be with concepts or anything else. So conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories very often are taking a bunch of unrelated stuff and showing that there are connections. Okay, now I'm not gonna say too much because I think that the terms that are gonna be later in this lecture are gonna kind of help out with respect to this. But yes, apophenia is just the broad umbrella of phenomena in psychology that note that we very often connect unrelated things with meaning. And then pareidolia is seeing faces, is a subtype of it, and the clustering illusion, which was that GIF of all of the random dots, and then suddenly we started to see patterns in the dots. Now, what this kind of stuff is doing, bias being a tendency, heuristic being a mental shortcut, apophenia, clustering illusion, is basically just giving us terms for naming the fast, mostly unconscious, mostly unchanging. There's a lot of controversy as to whether we can actually train this out of ourselves, but there are these patterns in the ways that we think. And part of getting older, part of hopefully becoming educated, is maybe figuring out the ways in which we think. Even if we can't change them initially, we can kind of calibrate for them. That's just kind of how it is. Okay, so far, I've basically talked about this in fairly neutral terms. Bias as a tendency, heuristic as a mental shortcut, clustering illusions as just random data, we're seeing patterns, epiphania, where we're connecting unrelated phenomena, but we say that there's meaning behind it. All of that's fairly neutral. It might valence a little bit toward bad, but fairly neutral. Now, though, I want to spend some time talking about some bad examples, and this is where the textbook for the class kind of comes in. This is David McRaney's You Are Not So Smart. This is a book that I recommend to just general people because I think the chapters are short and engaging. I think David McRaney does a decent job of being a sort of pop writer on these kinds of things. He knows enough about the empirical literature to convey what he wants to. He usually gives citations or scientist names so that if you wanted to look up more, you could look up more. This is the textbook for our class. It's the only textbook for the class. So this is where a lot of it is coming from. And if you want more details, please read this. I'm going to try not to go over too many of the specifics in here because I figure if you want to read McRaney, you can read McRaney. There's also an audiobook version. So I don't know if this will stay current in the future, but as of right now, fall 2024, there is basically a version that's included with an Audible membership if you have it, if you want to support Audible or anything like that. But it's out there. It's pretty easy to find, pretty cheap. I highly recommend it. So, against the background of our cognitive capacity, our psychological capacity to find patterns in things, I'm going to talk about three things in particular: the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, the gambler's fallacy, and confirmation bias. Okay, so for the Texas sharpshooter's fallacy, this is it. Imagine that there's a cowboy, and this cowboy is taking off just sort of random shots at the side of a barn. And eventually, the barn is going to look like this. But the cowboy, in an effort to kind of like make it look like he knew what he was doing, he decides to paint a target over the clusters of his bullets, even though he wasn't really aiming at anything in particular. And we could think about that in the following way. So you have this same pattern right here on the barn. Imagine what it would be like if the target were on the blue door, were on the left door there, versus us putting the target over top of the tightest clusters of the bullets. Basically, what the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is it's ignoring a bunch of data in order to emphasize your target or similarities between certain cases. Now, I'm just giving background as far as why it's called the Texas sharpshooter's fallacy. The idea is you do the shooting first, and then you paint the target on afterwards. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is a fallacy. It's a mistaken reasoning because it's not like you're identifying a pattern. You're going after the fact to rationalize what's going on or to make it look like you knew what was going on all the time. And so David McRaney has this really, really fantastic opening to the chapter, and this is the only time that I'll read his textbook. And he says this: Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy were both presidents of the United States, elected 100 years apart. Both were shot and killed by assassins who were known by three names with 15 letters: John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, and neither killer would make it to trial. Spooky, huh? It gets better. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. They were both killed on a Friday while sitting next to their wives, Lincoln in the Ford Theater, Kennedy in a Lincoln made by Ford. Both men were succeeded by men named Johnson, Andrew for Lincoln, Lyndon for Kennedy. Andrew was born 1808, Lyndon 1908. What are the odds? So whenever you have all of those facts listed one after the other, it seems as though it is more than coincidence. It starts to look suspicious. Again, this is one of the tendencies of conspiracy theorists. You put all of these facts together and your brain starts to make connections between things. But the thing is, there's not actually any connection between those two events. And so what McRaney says about the same Lincoln and Kennedy connection is this: when you are befuddled by the Lincoln and Kennedy connections, you neglect to notice that Kennedy was Catholic and Lincoln was Baptist. Kennedy was killed with a rifle, Lincoln with a pistol. Kennedy was shot in Texas, Lincoln in Washington, D.C. Kennedy had lustrous auburn hair, while Lincoln wore a haberdasher's wet dream. Basically, McRaney goes on to say, there are thousands of differences, all of which you ignored. So that's what makes this a fallacy. Could there be similarities between things? Absolutely. Okay. But what makes it a fallacy, especially the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, is that sometimes our brains, in finding patterns, or our desire to find meaning, or just the human capacity to make a narrative or a story out of things, something that we just naturally do, right? Little kids are naturals at telling stories. That's it's just part of what it means to be human, especially to have the power of language where we can share these stories. Very often, though, whenever we're making these stories, it ignores so much. And the story or the information that's inspiring the story could be interpreted in many different ways. The sharpshooter fallacy says, beware the people who sort of paint the target onto the data as opposed to having the target and kind of aiming it with the metaphor of someone who's shooting. You just have to be careful about interpreting the data because any interpretation potentially, whenever it's vicious or bad, could leave a lot of randomness, a lot of noise, a lot of important data out of the pattern. That's just part of what it is. So be very, very careful. So I think that there is a cure to something like the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, and that is just to be honest. Be honest to the randomness, be honest to the noise, be honest to the limitations of your own analysis or interpretation. And very often, what you should try to do is to be as explicit as possible about your goals. So again, borrowing from science and the ways in which the scientific method very often is you observe something, you come up with a question about that thing, then you come up with a hypothesis that generally makes some sort of prediction, and then you come up with a testable procedure where you test to see whether your hypothesis is right, and you test it with multiple variables, a normal that kind of like is something that you're basing it against, but then you have experimental variables that could potentially prove you wrong, and then you conclude, were your observations and hypotheses correct, or does it seem like some other competing theory is correct? And then you try to repeat this to try and figure out whether you were good or not, right? That's the sort of basic scientific method. Now, in scientific journals, one of the important things that they often ask you to do is not just to do the scientific method, not just to submit the data, not just to do all of the number crunchy stuff, but there's usually also a place where you disclose if you had funders for the research. Because the idea is maybe your scientific results are affected if they're being funded by certain organizations. Similarly, if there is political research, you can very often take into account who that person's loyal party is or whose think tank, who funds that particular think tank or whatever else. That might influence the information. Now, should it? The answer is no. Because if we're thinking like scientists, if we're thinking like people who are thinking through political issues or philosophical issues or ethical issues or whatever else, we should be trying to be as unbiased or as impartial as possible, trying to make sense of stuff, trying to make sure that stuff is turning out well. But that's very often not the case. And the Texas sharpshooter fallacy just kind of has us remember that something that, whenever we're giving an interpretation, there could be a lot of stuff that we're ignoring to get that interpretation. So we just have to be careful. The second thing that I want to talk about is from a very famous casino. In fact, that's what it's named after. So maybe you've heard of the Monte Carlo Casino. We're going to talk about the gambler's fallacy. So this is a picture of the Monte Carlo Casino in Monaco, and this is a roulette wheel, which is, in case you don't know what it is, it's a way of gambling where there's a wheel that spins, you drop the ball randomly, because it's a spinning wheel, ends up in a tray in a red or a black or very rare green space. There are two colors, dominantly red and black. There are two types of numbers, odd and even. The exceptions are some casinos will add a green 0, or maybe they'll also add on top of that another green 00, and those don't count in the normal things. It's a way of the casino basically stacking the odds to make sure that they always make their money, right? But the Monte Carlo Casino had this really infamous thing happen in the early 1900s, and it was basically this. So think through this with me. Maybe I'll go back a slide, okay? Imagine that you're in the casino. Imagine that you're at a roulette wheel, and Black comes up once. Okay, great. No big deal. But then it comes up 3 times. And so you start to wonder what's going on. Then it comes up 5 times. It's been black 5 times in a row, 10 times in a row. So the question is, after it's hit black 10 times in a row, which way are you going to bet? It hits black 15 times in a row. Where are you going to bet? 20 times in a row. Where are you going to bet? 25 times in a row. Where are you going to bet? So what happened at the Monte Carlo Casino in 1913 was that black came up 26 times in a row. 26 times in a row. And the casino made millions on people basically betting that red had to come up next. It had to. So what is going on here is a version of the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is a fallacy because basically what it does is it's seeing independent events as related and making some outcome more likely in the future, especially in this roulette example. But the gambler's fallacy is seeing independent events as related. That's the most fundamental part. There is no connection between one roulette spin and another. If you have 2 random decks of cards, there is no connection between the number that you pull out of one and the number that you pull out of another. They are completely separate decks. They are completely separate rolls on a roulette wheel. Nonetheless, your brain is a pattern machine and will find patterns. And that is just something that especially casinos can exploit. They can exploit. So, it's a little bit different. So humans, behavioral patterns, probably not as random. There are ways in which if someone lies to you once, okay, maybe it's just like a bad interaction. A couple of times, okay, maybe I'm starting to be skeptical. But if there's a history of lying, that might set out a real disposition in that person to maybe not be honest or maybe not be trustworthy, especially in certain situations, right? But there are other cases where the events are not related at all. Roulette, for example, right? It would be very weird for us to anthropomorphize or to project human qualities onto the roulette wheel and say, because it's come up black 20 times, it has to come up red. That's just not how it works. The house always wins. They cook in the odds to make sure. And I think that that's the cure to something like the gambler's fallacy. You realize that especially with these independent events, especially with these like gambling things, the house always wins. And they make a lot of money hoping that your pattern machine of a brain convinces you otherwise, convinces you that you think that there's a way to beat the house, or you think that there's a way to make sense of the roulette wheel spins or something like that. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. At least not with luck. With skill, maybe so. Now this is a little bit of a digression, right? But it might have been Veritasium, and maybe he's on my mind because I'm going to bring him up later here in the lecture. If you, for example, were playing if you wanted to play Michael Jordan in a game of one-on-one basketball, right? Or Cheryl Swoops or whoever else it is. If you want the maximal chance at beating that person, assuming you're not like a really great basketball player, maybe you are, what you would do is you would agree to basically one game, first score wins. Because what you want to do is minimize skill as much as possible. Over many games and over a much higher score, a high skill player is going to be able to smoke you. But you might get that one lucky shot. So there are ways even that sports kind of work with this kind of thing. So you can look at playoff formats. So for example, in football, the playoff format is one loss and you're out. Skill has a really big component of it, but also a big component of it is luck. Whereas something like baseball or a tournament where you have series of 7 games, so you have to win 4 of the series, that's going to select for the higher skill team, realizing that even if there's bad luck is not going to triumph a majority of the times. Skill is going to win out in that particular format. So, gambler's fallacy, just to take it back to the point, right, is seeing otherwise independent events as connected. And it's called the gambler's fallacy because it's finds its origin, at least popularly, to that Monte Carlo casino time whenever black came up 26 times in a row and the casino made a ton of money because the people kept saying red has to come up next, red has to come up next, red has to come up next, and it didn't, and the house just took everyone's money, right? Okay, so as I said, Veritasium was going to come up. Veritasium is a really fantastic YouTube channel if you like science, if you like just general educational entertainment. The main guy who runs it, Derek, I'm forgetting his last name right now. I think he's just a really engaging speaker. But he plays this game, and I often like to play this with my classes in person. Unfortunately, there's no chance for this. But Derek has this very simple game, and it is this. He will give a pattern of 3 numbers, okay? And then so if you want to play this with your friends, you can allow your friend, or you, in this instance with me, to propose another set of 3 patterns. And the game is this. You're trying to figure out what the rule is that determined my numbers in the first place. So, I tell you that my pattern is 2, 4, 8. The numbers are 2, 4, and 8. And I tell you there is a pattern to those numbers. Your goal is to tell me the pattern, but first you have to propose 3 numbers that you think fit the pattern that I'm using. So, for example, the very frequent guess after I say that my numbers are 2, 4, and 8, someone will probably say something, okay, 10, 12, 14. And then I have to say whether that fits my pattern or not. And in this case, I would say, yes, that fits my pattern. And so then the person will guess something like, oh, so your pattern is even numbers. And I reveal, no, my pattern actually isn't even numbers, okay? And so that means they have to come up with another set of 3 numbers. Another set that very often comes up is, okay, your numbers are 2, 4, and 8. I think another set of numbers that would follow the same sequence is 4, 8, and 16, where what's going on is there's a doubling, or maybe there's an exponent in base 2, where you're just raising the exponent on the 2. And I would say that does fit my pattern. But if they say that it's about exponents, or if it's about multiplying the previous number by 2, I would have to say, no, that does not fit my pattern. Now, what happens in this video that I think is really excellent, Derek goes out and he interviews various people. What people very often do is they start out just trying to prove the pattern that they think is right, correct. There's always a breakthrough in the 2, 4, 8 pattern finding game whenever someone starts to make patterns that they think will break the sequence. So rather than trying to get a yes from me, do my 3 numbers fit your pattern? Trying to get the no is often really interesting. So people will be like, well, I don't know. Then what about like 11, 15, 120? Trying to break the pattern. If I say, yes, that still fits my pattern. Okay, so 11, that was an odd number, so it can't be anything about evens and odds. I put 11, that's a prime number, but 120 isn't a prime number, so it's not about prime numbers or anything like that. The person is trying to think through what's going on, but then eventually someone says, I don't know, what about 3, 2, 1? And then I say, no, that does not fit my pattern. And then someone suddenly realizes, well, maybe your pattern is just numbers in ascending order. And that's all it is. That's all the game is. The pattern 2, 4, 8, the pattern there that Derek sets out in the video and that I use whenever I teach this class is just numbers in ascending order. But you don't pick up on that until you try to break the rule. Breaking the rule is a really important thing trying to consider information that is an alternative or that can help you to think differently is really, really important in thinking. And that is exhibited in another very famous psychological test called the Wasson, W-A-S-O-N, W-A-S-O-N, the Wasson selection task. Okay. And so I took these graphics from Wikipedia, but here's the Wasson selection task. I put out 4 cards on a table, and I tell you that each and every card has a number on one side and a color on the other. That's guaranteed. A number on one side and a color on the other. Now, here's the question. So we have 4 cards on the table, as is. We have a card with a 3, a card with an 8, we have a card with a blue color, and we have a card with a red color. Now, the question to you is, in as few cards as possible, which cards would you need to flip over to see if the cards follow the following rule? If a card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is blue. If a card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is blue. So the question is, which cards do you have to turn over on the table to figure out whether that rule holds? The rule that if it's even on one side, then it has to be blue on the other. If it's even on one side, then it has to be blue on the other. Okay? So if you want to take a couple of moments to see if you can figure this out, pause the video, because I'm going to tell the answer now. Okay? So almost everyone gets that you have to flip 8, right? And the reason that you have to flip 8 is because if you flip 8 and there's a blue on the other side, then great. Your pattern is held. But if you flip 8 and there's a red, then you know that that rule has been broken, because the rule that we're testing is if there's an even on one side, then there is blue on the other. Now, at this point, people start to diverge and they might not get it. A lot of people think that you should turn over the blue card, but you actually don't have to turn it over, because it doesn't matter what's on the other side. If there's an odd number on the other side, our rule says nothing about odd numbers. If there's an even number on the other side, then the card obviously follows the rule. So it doesn't matter turning over the blue card. Now you do have to turn over the red card. Why? Because if you turn over the red card and there's an even number on that side, that card breaks the rule, meaning that the rule is not followed on the cards there. And so a lot of people miss having to turn over the red card because, again, they're only thinking of information that basically proves them right as opposed to what proves them wrong, which is what we're going to talk about with respect to confirmation bias. Now, what's interesting about the Wasson selection task is there are multiple variations. This one is done with numbers and colors, but it's really easy if we take it to be something more practical. So let's assume that the drinking age is 21, as it is in the United States at this time, and that each card represents a patron in your bar, or let's say a bar that you're inspecting as a member of the authorities, right? And you want to make sure that the bar is following the law with respect to what the patrons are drinking. Now, each card has a number on one side, which represents the patron's age, and a beverage on the other side. So the task here is, if each of these 4 cards represents a patron with their age on one side and their drink on the other side, which cards would you have to turn over to figure out whether the bar is following the rules of not serving alcohol to anyone under the age of 21? Now, very quickly, people figure out that you need to turn over the beer card, because if you turn over the beer card, and if it's 20 years old or lower, you know that the bar has broken the law. Do you need to turn over the soda card? No, because anyone could drink the soda. Do you need to turn over the card of the person who's 25 years old? No, it doesn't matter what they're drinking. They can drink beer, they can drink soda, it doesn't matter. You need to turn over the card of the 16-year-old, though. Because if the 16-year-old has a beer, you know that the bar is not following the law. So again, there's this tendency, and this is called confirmation bias, to look only for information that supports our own beliefs. It's called confirmation bias because we only look for information that proves ourselves right. Now, contemporarily, this can be related to something called the filter bubble. The filter bubble, and this is a phenomenon that's been noted in search engine design or even in social media with preference algorithms. The idea is a lot of technology basically adapts to give us only stuff that it thinks that we'll like. And that is mirroring our natural bias to only look for information that proves ourselves right. So if we suspect our friend of being a bad friend, one of the toxic things that we might do, depending on the stakes. I mean, if it's really high stakes, you have to scrutinize stuff. Okay, I'm not telling you not to do this. But if it's a normal thing, one of the worst things that we could do is just ruminate on all of the bad stuff, because we start to only find patterns of the bad stuff. Okay, confirmation bias is basically just the idea that we're looking only for information that proves our preconceived notions or our prejudices or our biases correct. The cure is kind of like the scientific method. A proper scientific investigation will always look at or look for alternative theories, explanations, and hypotheses or theses to explain something. Part of what science is very often trying to do is to prove the theories wrong. And this is especially easy to do in something like ethics or politics or science, where theories often are competing against other theories. Okay? If I, for example, want to figure out what career I should go after, it's not just that I'm guessing randomly. I probably have 2 or 3 options that I'm considering in between. So what I do is I argue for and against one, for and against another, for and against another, as opposed to just looking at the metrics that would make my favored career the proper one. Confirmation bias, just like the game of 248, where the people just answer stuff that proves their ingrained theory correct. Confirmation bias says naturally we will gravitate towards stuff that proves us right, as opposed to stuff that might prove us wrong. Now, evolutionarily, again, this might make sense. Remember that type 1 stuff operating on autopilot, that can get us going most of the way. The pattern of even numbers 248 can get us lots of patterns that would match Derek's pattern, because it happens to match up in certain ways. But if we want actual truth, if we want actual accuracy, we have to try to break it and find the precise pattern. Now, does that mean that we have to slow down? We have to move from that system 1 process to system 2 processes. We have to be a little bit more critical. Absolutely it does. But that's what we need to do when the stakes are a little bit higher, when we're trying to figure stuff out, because our natural tendency is going to be to only look for information that proves ourselves correct, that proves ourselves right. Okay. So the summary is our brains are really amazing. They really are. I took some classes in neuroscience when I was in college just because I found this stuff really fascinating. In logic and critical thinking, I think it's building on the same sorts of stuff. Our brains are a wonder. We can do so many things whenever our brain is functioning right. We can find patterns in stuff. We can figure out stuff that we've never heard. Even language kind of proves this. There are sentences that have never been said that you nonetheless could understand. That's the amazing thing about language. People can reveal new things. You can hear a new song. You can read a new poem. You can watch a new movie just because of the creativity of the human mind. Nonetheless, because our brains are so good at finding patterns, because we can see a circle with 2 dots and a curve as a face. Sure, upside, we get emoji. Downside is we see faces in toast or in mountain ranges on Mars. So we need to be aware of the fact that our same cognitive faculties that really help us out, that give our lives meaning and stuff like that, can actually go in the wrong direction. And very often what we need to do is make sure that we're testing our ideas and that we're asking cui bono, who benefits? Who stands to benefit from this? Someone trying to sell me something? Is someone trying to get me to buy into their authority? What's going on? How do I break this sort of thing down? And I'm going to give you a couple of ancient maxims here. Maybe it's because one of my specializations is ancient Greek philosophy, but also it's just cool stuff. One of the oldest maxims, especially in Greek philosophy, and this was inscribed on religious temples. It was something that philosophers often said. It's a really, really difficult thing to do, and it is know thyself. That's what this lesson and the next lesson are going to be about with respect to biases and heuristics. It's just knowing ourselves. It's okay if you're imperfect. It's okay if you have these biases or heuristics, especially if you've tried to train it out of yourself and it's just not working. But what knowing yourself can do is it can help you to mitigate or to reduce some of the harms because you know which direction you're biasing in. You can kind of account for that. So if your car drifts a little bit to the left, first of all, please go to the mechanic. Have your alignment checked out. I don't want you all driving unsafe cars or whatever. But if it's driving a little bit to the left, you have to compensate going to the right. If in a game, that you're going to be really fast but not very strong, you can try and manipulate the game environment to favor your speed and not favor your strength. Okay? It's about knowing yourself, knowing your limitations, figuring that sort of stuff out. And one of the most famous, maybe the most famous philosophers, is this guy named Socrates. And in this very famous dialogue called The Apology, one of the conclusions that he ends up kind of thinking about, he's called the wisest philosopher in his society. And he doesn't believe that. And he goes and asks a bunch of people who he thinks are wiser than him. And it turns out that they don't really know. And so after having talked to a lot of wise people who thought that they knew something, but then Socrates asked them a bunch of questions and they actually don't end up knowing anything at all, Socrates settles on maybe the source of his wisdom is knowing that he doesn't know. So Socrates has this paradoxical phrase, I know that I do not know. I know that I do not know. And from his perspective, the idea is that it's better to be the kind of person who understands when they don't know something than to be the kind of person who presumes that they know what's going on whenever actually they don't have any knowledge. Phrased differently, maybe the idea is that, especially in something like a community, the person who is aware of their limitations and who will say, listen, I don't know, maybe I'll look into that. I'll investigate, I'll go ask some other people. That person is way less harmful than the person who says that they're an expert in an area or says that they really understand something, but they don't actually. Who leads you into more trouble? The expert who says they have an expertise, but they actually don't, or the person who says, I don't know, but maybe I can find out, maybe we can see what's going on. In the same way, that's the same thing with biases and heuristics. Biases as just general tendencies, heuristics as mental shortcuts. And again, the shortcuts cut out a lot of stuff and they can get us sort of good enough answers, but probably not perfect answers. But again, when it comes to something like figuring out how we should live our lives, what's going to make us most happy, or what's going to fulfill our lives with most meaning, or in our communities, what's going to lead to less oppression, what's going to lead to better lives for children in our communities, or for people who have disabilities in our communities, or for racial and ethnic minorities in our communities, something like that, right? We should probably not just rely on our gut instincts. We should probably not just rely on what we know is the natural human tendency to have biases or to use heuristics to make quick and dirty judgments. Can that get us part of the way there? Probably. But when problems are very complicated, when there is disagreement between things, what you have to do is try as much as possible to move from that fast, dirty, intuitive system one, slow down, start thinking about opposite things, start thinking about competing theories, start finding ways to test the ideas, go into that system two area to try and figure out the really, really important stuff in life. So thank you for being here. Thank you for paying attention to all my words. We'll pick up and talk about a few more biases next time. Have a good night.